Throughout the years, Final Fantasy games have featured some fantastic summons. Some, like Ifrit, Shiva and Bahamut, have been mainstays ever since Final Fantasy III. But there has also been plenty of room for growth, with developers keen to introduce new summons wherever possible. Not all of these have stood the test of time, but some have managed to make a name for themselves, and one of the most intriguing is Garuda. For many years, Garuda was part of the bestiary. Sometimes it would be as a boss, but most of the time players would see Garuda within random encounters. That would change with Final Fantasy XI, as Garuda was promoted to being a summon. This would be pivotal, as even though other development teams would continue to see Garuda as an enemy to be fought, Creative Business Unit 3, who inherited Final Fantasy XI, would continue to shine the spotlight on Garuda as a summon. It makes this evolutionary tale one of the most interesting that we've covered so far, as it touches on so many different aspects. But even though there is the distinction between Garuda as an enemy and Garuda as a summon, there are still plenty of traits that are either inherited or evolved over time. And throughout this video, we're going to take you on an expansive journey where we'll explore how every single appearance of Garuda has tied together to create something really quite special. Garuda has a strong association with Hinduism. Depicted as a giant eagle-like bird with a radiant sun colouring, Garuda served as the mount of Vishnu. Within this context, it would sometimes be referred to as the king of the birds, and its power was well respected. Within the Mahabharata, one of the two Sanskrit epics, Garuda was also shown to have a particular disdain for snakes, and it would choose to dine on this particular type of meat. There are also wider references, also carried forward into Buddhism, about a race of birds called the Garuda who devour snakes. And within these scripts, there would even be references to Garuda being anthropomorphic, combining bird-like traits with physical human qualities. Many of these traits were then carried forward through to the representation of Garuda within the Final Fantasy franchise. But even though some would be immediately apparent, others would take many, many years to manifest. Garuda would first appear in Final Fantasy III. As the player ventured to Saronia, they would find the kingdom bewitched by the guiles of an advisor known as Gigametz. Once his spell started to wear thin, Gigametz would transform into Garuda and attempt to defeat the party. It would see Garuda appear before the party as a monstrous anthropomorphic bird. Featuring two large flame-coloured wings, Garuda would have a green body, a red bird-like head, and two long humanoid legs with talons on the end. The ensuing encounter could present a considerable challenge should the party not be sufficiently prepared, and this was because even though Garuda did not have any elemental affinities or weaknesses, it would utilise the lightning spell to deal considerable amounts of damage. This would end up being a strong showing, but Garuda did not feature within Final Fantasy IV. Instead, the next appearance would be in Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and this was interesting for numerous reasons. Prior to the release of Mystic Quest, Garuda had featured within every iteration of the Saga franchise, also known as Final Fantasy Legend in North America. The team that developed the third iteration of Saga were then tasked with producing Mystic Quest, and they brought forth many of the same elements, including Garuda. It was for this reason that the Garuda we saw within Mystic Quest had very little in common with the Garuda seen within Final Fantasy III, and this related to almost every single aspect of both visual and game design. Garuda were now generic enemies, and they could be encountered within the area outside the town of Windia. As the name suggested, this area of the map had a strong affinity with wind, and the town was battered by gusts and gales. This then translated through to the Garuda. Like many other enemies in the region, the Garuda were strong to earth elemental attacks, but weak to wind elemental attacks. And as they were flying enemies, they were also weak to shoot elemental attacks. They could use a wide array of abilities, but none related to lightning. Instead, they could use Typhoon, a wind-based attack, and a small collection of abilities that were connected with status effects. Blinder, for example, can inflict blind, Muffle could inflict silence, and Iron Nail could inflict defense down. The other area that had the least deviation was the visual design, but there were still some changes. Garuda would have two fiery red wings, and these were connected to a humanoid torso, and two legs then protruded with talons on the end. but the torso was now orange as opposed to green, and Garuda seemed to wear some kind of headgear. As the inclusion of Garuda in Mystic Quest had come as a result of the team inheriting materials from Saga, it remained absent from mainline entries until Final Fantasy VII. Here, Garuda would return as a random encounter, and they could primarily be found in Wutai. And perhaps because the enemy type had not been seen for many years, the developers chose to reference both previous iterations. From Mystic Quest came the elemental associations. This meant Garuda were immune to earth elemental attacks and weak to wind elemental attacks. But as an evolution, Garuda were also capable of absorbing ice and lightning elements. From Final Fantasy III came the offensive association with lightning, as Garuda would use Bolt 2, but they could also use Ice 2 and Dance, an ability that had similar functionality to Osmos. The visuals were an amalgamation of previous entries. It saw Garuda have a green body and 2 wings, although the wings were now a shimmering shade of purple. There was also a kind of headgear. Where this visual style differed though was that the Garuda carried a rod, something that required the addition of 2 humanoid arms, and the legs were now more bird-like. Garuda would not appear within Final Fantasy VIII, but they would make a triumphant return in Final Fantasy IX, becoming infamous due to the challenge they posed within early game encounters. But if the player was successful, they would gain access to a powerful piece of blue magic, White Wind. Garuda could be found at Popos Heights, an area accessible through Gizmaluk's grotto. Compared to many other random encounters, and even boss encounters, they would present a significant challenge, and this was due to their high HP, but also their powerful moveset. This would include Aerial Slash, which would deal wind damage to all party members, and Firaga, the first time Garuda had been associated with fire. In addition, Garuda could inflict a negative status in Stop, and could use Maelstrom, a horrible ability that would reduce every party member down to between 1 and 10 HP. Garuda did, however, have a weakness. Much like in Mystic Quest and Final Fantasy VII, Garuda were weak to wind elemental attacks and also shadow, but as the counter, they were immune to earth. Perhaps the biggest change for this Garuda came with aesthetics, and this was doubly true as there were 2 types of Garuda. This meant the humanoid aspects were ditched, with the main variant appearing as a giant bird. The friendly variant was similar, but much more dynamic, and this was perhaps best evidenced via its rainbow colouring. Final Fantasy X would feature a very different form of Garuda. It would build upon aspects seen within Final Fantasy IX, but strip many others away. Garuda would still be a random encounter, found in numerous locations throughout Spira, but most elemental affinities, both positive and negative, were removed. The only exception was that Garuda was susceptible to darkness, a trait only just introduced within Final Fantasy IX. This notion then transferred to abilities. Garuda could use an ability called Sonic Boom, but despite the name, this was a non-elemental attack. The bird-like form from Final Fantasy IX would carry over, but the visual aesthetic was now much different. Appearing as a variant of Zoo, Garuda were massive in scale and had long necks with a beige and red colour palette. This interpretation of Garuda would then resurface within games such as Record Keeper and Opera Omnia, and in the latter instance, traits were modified. They were classified as a Zoo-type enemy, and were made resistant to thunder elemental attacks, but weak to wind elemental and ranged attacks. They would also use the lightning spell to deal damage, a nice throwback to Final Fantasy III. By the time Final Fantasy XI entered into development, even though Garuda had appeared within consecutive games, something that had never happened before, it was far from being a mainstay within the bestiary. This low profile made Garuda's appearance within Final Fantasy XI all the more intriguing, as instead of appearing as a boss or random encounter, Garuda was elevated to the role of summon. On the surface, this might have seemed quite random, but the core leadership team working on Final Fantasy XI were also significant contributors to Final Fantasy III, as well as the Seiken Densetsu franchise. Even though numerous Final Fantasy games would feature Garuda, Final Fantasy III represented its biggest narrative involvement to date, and the enemy type would also feature within the original Seiken Densetsu, its sequel, Sword of Mana, and then Legend of Mana. For Final Fantasy XI, the elevated role of Garuda would see it positioned as one of the 8 celestial avatars, alongside the likes of venerable summons such as Ifrit, Shiva, and Leviathan. Its elemental affinity was designated as Wind, and from a narrative perspective, Garuda was positioned as the Queen of Birds, an interesting ode back to its mythological origins as the King of the Birds. This title would be granted due to Garuda's fanatic efforts to save a prince who was dear to her, and it was those efforts who would see a small bird with a jade hue promoted by the goddess to the heavens, with legend stating that Garuda helps guide birds as they fly throughout Vana'diel. Garuda could be obtained from the Cloister of Gales, with the player needing to overcome Garuda Prime. Garuda Prime would feature numerous elemental affinities, but they would vary from previous iterations. It would see Garuda absorb wind elemental attacks as opposed to being weak to them, with it also having strong defense against earth elemental attacks. Ice attacks would instead be Garuda's weakness, a trait never seen before. During the encounter, players would see a return of the anthropomorphic Garuda, featuring 2 wings as well as 2 arms and legs that each had talons in the end. Each element would have different hues of jade. This would be reminiscent of earlier Garuda iterations, but the main difference, outside of there being different shades of the same colour, was that Garuda would now have a humanoid face as opposed to a bird-like one. Once obtained, players would be able to call upon the powers of Garuda in battle, and this would see an expanded moveset created that would contain the likes of Aerial Blast and various iterations of aerial magic, as well as enhancement spells such as Aerial Armour and Garuda's Favour. Perhaps the most intriguing ability though was Whispering Wind. This had nearly identical functionality to White Wind, positioned as a nod back to Final Fantasy IX, where Quina could learn White Wind by consuming a Garuda. After a strong showing in Final Fantasy XI, Garuda returned in Final Fantasy XII, and even though it would revert back to being an enemy, its role was elevated. Garuda would appear as a boss inside the Tomb of Wraithwall, and its appearance will be perhaps the most faithful when compared to mythology. It would see Garuda have a shimmering gold colour palette, a clear reference back to the radiant sun colouring. Further to this, within the bestiary, it was said that Garuda feasted on serpent meat. When encountered, Garuda would have no traditional elemental strengths or weaknesses, but it was weak to dark, a nod back to Final Fantasy IX and X, and it would absorb the holy element. Its attacks also had the chance to inflict sleep, perhaps a reference back to some of the earlier entries where Garuda can inflict negative status effects. Much like in Final Fantasy IX, there were also 2 variants of Garuda. The main variant would be the one fought in the Tomb of Wraithwall, but the lesser variant, which did not have the shimmering gold colour palette, could be encountered within the Paramina Rift. It would be much the same, but would use a self-sacrifice ability to try and deal maximum damage ahead of inevitable defeat. Garuda would next appear within the Final Fantasy III Remake. Many of the elements would be nearly identical, but from a visual perspective, Garuda would undergo a significant change. The general form is similar, with Garuda still appearing as an anthropomorphic bird-human hybrid, but the colour palette was now very different. Instead of Garuda being a mix of fiery colours and shades of green, it was now very pale, with red accents appearing via clothing and other physical elements. The next appearance of Garuda would be in Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles Ring of Fates, and there were numerous sources of inspiration on display. Garuda would be fought as a boss 2 times, once at the summit of Mount Val and once within the Lunite Temple. During these encounters, its ability set was quite limited, but it would have an elemental affinity with ice, a throwback to Final Fantasy XI. Perhaps the clearest influence though was Final Fantasy X, and this was because Garuda was depicted as a giant bird and classified as a zoo-type enemy. Its colour palette would differ however, as Garuda was now blue with an orange body. This iteration of Garuda then carried forward into Crystal Chronicles Echoes of Time. Even though it was part of the same universe, the Garuda featured within Crisis Core had very little in common with the Garuda that appeared within the original Final Fantasy VII. Accounted within Mission 946, Garuda would be huge birds that served as the ultimate variant of their enemy type. The design featured a beige body with 2 colourful wings that centered around a purple colour palette. Perhaps the most noticeable aspect, however, was the huge growth that extended forward from the top of its head. Gameplay would harken back to earlier days, with it having a strong affinity with lightning. They would use the Tri-Thundergar ability and would also absorb the lightning element. During the early stages of Final Fantasy XIII, Garuda was planned to be a fal'Cie. This would be cut during development, but Garuda would still appear within the game thanks to the Garuda Interceptor. This was a boss that would be encountered in Lake Brescia, and it featured some very interesting evolutions. For one, the Garuda Interceptor was classified as a wyvern as opposed to a bird. and it was also a bioweapon as it had mechanical components. Despite these interesting changes in classification, Garuda inherited numerous game design elements. It would, for example, be weak to wind elemental attacks and strong to earth, and it would also utilize lightning-based attacks, with the most powerful being the Hellstorm Bolt. The Garuda Interceptor would then reappear within Final Fantasy XIII too, but this time it was simply just called Garuda, and its importance was reduced to being a standard enemy that would appear within random encounters. By the time Final Fantasy XIV entered into development, Garuda had started to become more of a mainstay within the numbered entries, but even though that was the case, its only appearance as a summoner had been within Final Fantasy XI. That standing was then maintained as Garuda appeared as a primal within the original version of Final Fantasy XIV, and that status would continue when A Realm Reborn was launched a few years later. Within the narrative, Garuda was associated with the Exile. They believed that Garuda slew the Lord of the Snakes, feasting on its corpse to regain its strength, but the reality was not quite so grand. The Allagan Empire created Ixalian, maintenance creatures that served the Garuda Airborne Division. After the Allagan Empire fell, the Ixalian mutated into Ixal, and over time, the myth around Garuda was created. Garuda would first be encountered during the story in the Howling Eye Trial. Here, players would witness a Garuda that was every bit inspired by Final Fantasy XI, and this related to not just visual design, but also game design. Garuda was once again anthropomorphic, but it was now elevated. This would see 4 wings featured, with smaller wings also protruding. The bodice would also now be much more armoured, and the jade hue was still present, but enhanced with blacks and whites. The fight itself would have numerous phases, and Garuda's signature move, Aerial Blast, would greet players at the halfway point. Alongside this, a whole host of new abilities would feature, such as Wicked Wheel, Mistral Song, and Mistral Shriek. Extras would then appear within subsequent encounters. Within the Howling Eye Hard, for example, Garuda would be assisted by Supana and Chirada, and within the Weapons Refrain Ultimate, moves such as Slipstream and Wicked Tornado would be added to Garuda's ability set. These would help to create the most comprehensive iteration of Garuda to date, and such was its quality that the viewpoint of Garuda within the rest of the franchise would start to change. Perhaps the most interesting example of this was within Final Fantasy XV. Even though Garuda did not appear as one of the astrals that Noctis could call upon within the base game, this changed as part of patch 1.27. This patch added a quest called Adventurer from Another World, and alongside featuring a Final Fantasy XIV inspired iteration of Garuda as a boss, Garuda would also become summonable despite not being an astral. Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 would take this notion a step further. It would be the first non-MMO to have Garuda feature as a summon, but there wasn't just one Garuda, there were multiple. These would be associated with Rhaeg and Maena, and in each instance it was associated with the wind element. There would also be clear visual references to Final Fantasy XIV. However, while Rhaeg's Garuda would use Aerial Blast, Maena's would use a move called Freeze Spacetime. Brave Exvius would continue with the theme of Garuda being a summonable entity. However, there was a distinct difference. Each of the previous iterations of Garuda being summonable could be traced back to Final Fantasy XI. The iteration in Brave Exvius was not. Instead, it paid tribute to the more conventional interpretation of Garuda from the earlier Final Fantasy games, even introducing the demonic face from the original Seiken Densetsu. Its game design would also reference many of those earlier games. Garuda would have elemental affinities with wind, earth and lightning, and could make use of both thunder and aero spells. That then brings us to Final Fantasy XVI. Although much is still to be revealed, there are some intriguing elements that have been brought to the fore. Perhaps the most obvious is that this iteration of Garuda has been inspired by Final Fantasy XIV. This is true from the visual perspective, but we have also seen a few of Garuda's moves carry forward, such as Aerial Blast and Wicked Wheel, a move that Clive is able to use himself, and some of Garuda's assistants. Outside of this, there is also a more subtle trait that's come to the fore. Garuda first appeared in Final Fantasy III as Gigametz. In this role, Gigametz was a treacherous spy who had been manipulating events. When backed against the wall, Gigametz then transformed into Garuda as a show of force. From what we've seen so far, this feels very similar to Benedicta Harmon. Although the motivations may be different, we know that she is effectively a spy who works on behalf of another. And due to the fundamental mechanics relating to the dominance, she will be able to transform into Garuda. As the franchise has developed, it's clear that Garuda has gone through a significant transition. Throughout the 8-bit and 16-bit era, Garuda was seldom used, even within the bestiary. This started to change during the PlayStation era, and since then, the profile of Garuda has only continued to rise. The elevation to being a summon then facilitated numerous evolutions. These evolutions have only become more pronounced over time through the use of different visual styles and colour palettes, different elemental affinities, and different abilities. And compared to many of the other summons that have graced the Final Fantasy franchise, it's led to perhaps one of the most extreme transformations. Garuda should still return as an enemy within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but beyond that, it'll be interesting to see which role future developers choose to offer Garuda and which sources of inspiration they choose to use. And with that, we have reached the conclusion of this study. If you enjoyed it, we'd like to ask you to consider liking the video. And as always, be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Feel free to also give suggestions about what you'd like us to tackle next within our evolutionary studies. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Gaussian Dikajata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.